I am running for president to lead a movement of Americans who will insist on changing Washington so we can renew America. A vitally important part of American renewal is renewing American leadership as a force for a lasting peace, especially in the Middle East. Today, the greatest obstacle toward achieving a real and lasting peace is not the strength of the enemy or the unwillingness of Israel to make great sacrifices for the sake of peace, but an inability on the part of the Obama administration and certain other world leaders to tell the truth about terrorism, to be honest about the publicly stated goals of our common enemies, and to devise policies appropriate to an honest accounting of reality. In his recent State Department speech, President Obama rightly stated that Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with a terrorist organization that denies its right to exist. But he then went on in the same speech to pressure Israel to do exactly that. President Obama wants Israel to enter into negotiations with a Palestinian Authority that is now in league with the terrorist organization Hamas. President Obama and his State Department should recall some basic facts. Hamas was founded as a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Its charter openly calls for Israel's destruction and instructs its followers to kill Jews wherever they find them. No country can be expected to conduct peace negotiations with a terrorist organization dedicated to its destruction, or with a Palestinian governmental authority that joins forces with such a terrorist organization. Because Hamas has not changed, an Israeli peace with Hamas is impossible. 20 years of hopes, 20 years of hopes for the so-called peace process cannot change this fundamental reality. It also means that entering into peace negotiations with any organization that includes Hamas is a fool's errand. It is something that no friend of Israel should ever ask Israel to do. President Obama has, in fact, called for a remarkable shift in U.S. policy regarding the peace process. He wants Israel to accept the indefensible lines of 1967 as the starting point of negotiations. Accepting such a proposal would be a suicidal step for Israel. Fortunately for Israel, the President's plan for Israel to accept the 1967 lines is an absolute non-starter with the American people. Like Israel, we are committed to seeing a peace agreement that protects Jerusalem as the undivided capital of the Jewish state. After all, it has only been under Jewish authority that religious freedom, including access to holy sites, for people of all faiths, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, has been protected. Meanwhile, we must readily see the President's policies for what they are: the dangerous accommodation of Middle East dictators, and worse, the accommodation of terrorist groups like Hamas, whose ideology virulently opposes freedom, compromise, and peace, and who view such accommodation as a weakening of U.S. resolve and commitment to Israel's security. The Palestinians have said that they will request UN recognition of Palestinian statehood based upon the 1967 borders. This action would violate every standing agreement the Palestinians have with Israel, including the Oslo Accords, to negotiate a final border agreement. Such a recognition would take place totally apart from any negotiation with Israel and without the Palestinians renouncing violence or acknowledging Israel's statehood. A vote by the General Assembly to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state would strengthen terrorists' belief that their commitment to violence and their unwavering rejection of Israel's right to exist has begun to produce their desired goals. Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, had it right when he said, quote, "When Israel, the only country in the world whose very existence is under attack, is consistently and conspicuously singled out for condemnation, I believe we are morally obligated to take a stand." Close quote. Our policies must reflect the fact that there is no moral equivalency between terrorist regimes and a legitimate self-governing country that abides by the rule of law. There are 9 specific policy proposals I would like to leave with you tonight. First, as a demonstration of this new resolve, the United States should move the American Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Israel has every right as a sovereign free nation to choose its own capital, and we should respect that choice. As President, on my first day in office, I will issue an executive order directing the U.S. Embassy in Israel to be moved to Jerusalem as provided for have to let me finish. To be moved to Jerusalem as provided for in the legislation I introduced in Congress in 1995. Second, the United States must refuse to participate in any talks involving terrorist organizations and cut off all direct and indirect aid to terrorists and their front groups. This must include the Palestinian Authority, so long as it includes Hamas and continues to produce propaganda, lionizing suicide bombers, and promoting the destruction of Israel. Three, the United States should explicitly reject the concept of a right of return for Palestinian refugees. The so-called right of return is a historically impossible demand that would be a demographic disaster and mean the end of the Jewish state of Israel. We are for a right to prosperity, a right to freedom, a right to the rule of law, a right to private property, but we must be totally opposed to a right of return. Fourth, the United Nations camp system must be replaced with a system of earned income and property rights to restore dignity and hope to every Palestinian. Fifth, we must also reestablish the United States Information Agency as a robustly funded, worldwide, anti-terrorism and pro-freedom communications and advocacy system. Sixth, we must aggressively confront the growing threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. The United States must lead the world in an all-out effort to replace the Iranian dictatorship using the diplomatic, economic, information, political, and covert tools President Ronald Reagan used to defeat and dismantle the Soviet Empire. Seventh, the United States must also establish an aggressive new strategy of taking back the United Nations from the forces of terrorism and dictatorship. The United States must be prepared to suspend all funding to the United Nations if the General Assembly Let me repeat this, but let me also note for you. This was Secretary of State Jim Baker's advice to President George H.W. Bush in 1989 in a similar situation. The United States must be prepared to suspend all funding to the United Nations if the General Assembly moves to recognize a Palestinian state under the control of Hamas. 8, all of this will require a restructured State Department, a new level of training and management for ambassadors, a new promotion system, and a profound shift in the culture of the Foreign Service. 9th, finally, the United States must establish an American energy policy designed to strengthen our national economy and weaken our opponents in the Middle East. Nothing will do more to alter the strategic balance of power away from dictatorships and state sponsors of terror than a successful American energy policy. In closing, if it were possible to say a word directly to the Israeli people, I would say this. We believe, together with you, that peace is possible and that peace ultimately will come to Israel. If Israel disarmed today, there would be no Israel tomorrow. But if Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups disarm today, then tomorrow we would have peace in the Middle East. The time has come to reaffirm America's commitment to freedom and the rule of law, to stand firmly and courageously against terrorism and evil organizations and dictatorships. It is time to stand firmly with our friends. Together, those of us who believe in freedom will defeat tyranny for the 4th time in a century. Together, we will earn for our children and grandchildren a freer and safer world. This is our duty. This is our generation's rendezvous with destiny. Thank you, and God bless you.